So thank you. Thank you for coming in, and especially thank you for coming in so late on a Saturday evening. Much appreciated. As most of you who've been attending webinars in this series, we usually do it early evening or afternoon on a Saturday. So today is a bit late, and so thank you so much for staying up and missing your dinner to join us this evening. So welcome to Ahmedabad University and to the conversation series. Um, a couple of quick admin details. In case you are joining in with a device name like iPhone or something, please change your screen name to your real name so that when you ask questions, we know who is asking the question. And obviously, during the conversation, except the two speakers, we will all remain on mute, so there is no extraneous noise in the discussion. Uh, um, and your questions are very welcome. So as questions or comments strike you, please keep typing them in the chat box. And in the later part of the conversation today, our speakers will pick up your questions and respond to them. So with that admin out of the way, let's get started. The conversation series is a series of webinars run by the Amrit Modi School of Management inside the Ahmedabad University. We have had an amazing lineup of thought leaders, academics, practitioners on this platform, and a very wide range of topics from banking to climate change to today globalization. So today's topic, as you have noticed, and as the poll questions indicated, the topic is this the end of the road for globalization? And we have two very eminent speakers to discuss this topic who know a lot about this. To set the background, a couple of decades ago, those of you who were here a couple of decades ago, I know we have a lot of students in our audience who probably won't relate to it, but in the late 1990s and early 2000s, globalization was the poster boy of the world. Everyone was very happy with globalization. There was free movement and goods and labors. Untapped markets were opening up to corporations. Living standards were going up. And especially after India started liberalizing in the early 1990s and after China joined the WTO in 2001, the world turned flat, or that is what many of us believe, that world was flat and everything was equitably distributed around the world. And there were some very drastic predictions made by some very well-known people. Without naming them, some people mentioned that globalization was a law of nature, just like gravity, and it was here to stay for eternity. Some said that we have killed the boom and bust cycles. You know who we are talking about. These were famous for last words. They didn't last very long. So the paint has started to come off from the shiny new toy of globalization. Poor are becoming poorer, rich are becoming richer. Labor practices are messy, to say the least. The 2008 financial crisis was probably the first minor speed breaker on this road, highway to globalization. Then the last few years of China-US trade wars have been a bigger speed bump on the road. And COVID-19 in the last few months has probably been more than a speed bump. It looks like a roadblock, and things have come to a screeching halt on the road to globalization. So the question before our speakers is whether this is just a minor setback. Are we going to be back to globalization, or are we entering the world, as some people say, the world of walls rather than the world of bridges? We need more bridges than walls, some people believe, and some people believe the opposite, and our speakers will sort this out for us once and for all. So that brings us to our speakers. We have two very eminent speakers. If I were to read their CVs, we would spend the next hour doing it. So I'll just, I'm sure all our audience are very familiar with Professor Jagdish Seth. Thank you, Professor Seth, for joining us. Professor Seth is the Charles H. Kelstad Professor of Business at the Guizetta Business School at Emory University in Atlanta. Professor Seth has straddled many disciplines from marketing, consumer behavior, marketing research, relationship marketing, competitive strategy, geopolitical analysis, and so on. He's written over 350 research papers and books on all of these disciplines and beyond. Professor Sheth has been um, doing this for over 50 years, and amazing energy and consistent energy over 5 decades. Professor Sheth has taught at various universities, from University of Southern California, University of Illinois, Columbia University, MIT, and now Emory University. And on a personal note, I personally have never met Professor Sheth except meeting you on screen. But I have I have grown up becoming a marketing research person, reading your work. So almost everything I know is from you, Professor Sheth. So it is an honor to introduce you personally and from on behalf of the university. So Professor Sheth will be in conversation with our very own Professor Pankaj Chandra, who actually genuinely doesn't need an introduction in this forum. Professor Chandra is the Vice Chancellor of Ahmedabad University. He's previously been the Director of IIM Bangalore, and he's taught at IIM Ahmedabad, at McGill University in Montreal, and as visiting professor in various universities around the world. So with that, I'll get out of the way and leave the floor to Professor Chandra.
Thank you very much, Ravi. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and good morning to you, Professor Sheth.
Good morning.
Let me take all of you back 100 years. The world 100 years ago saw the undoing of the dominant Austro-Hungarian Empire and the Russian and the German empires. It also saw the genocide by the Ottoman Empire, and closer to home, the painful occupations by the British and the Japanese empires across Asia, which led to a lot of inequalities and social and economic distress. Then came the crisis of 1929 in the US, the financial crisis of 1931, the two wars, and particularly the Second World War, with its accompanying escalation of nationalism, which made the countries realize the need to cooperate. And there was a complete turnaround in terms of the global order by that time. And it was turning out to be difficult to navigate individual nations' aspirations and fears by nations themselves. The Bretton Woods Conference of 1944 led to the formation of a system of global governance through international agencies like the UN. Subsequently, there have been several gains in that domain through a series of multilateral agencies like what Ravi mentioned, the WTO, and various pacts between the Committee of Nations. Now, with that, fast forward to 21st century, and Ravi has pointed out what was happening in the last decade. But interestingly, it has seen several signs of fatigue to global governance as well as global distress, starting with the war in Iraq in 2003, the financial crisis of 2008, some earlier health emergencies like SARS and Ebola, and now the pandemic of 2019. And all of it turned topsy-turvy our individual and collective lives. To top it, the report on 1.5 degrees Celsius warming by our own Professor P.R. Shukla and his colleagues from IPCC, have raised serious warning to the world about climate change and its impact on nations and the ways of its functioning. So to understand what has been driving globalization, global decision-making, global governance, and thereabout, I'm so delighted to have this conversation with you, Professor Sheth. And I'll start by two questions to you, and you can take it, because I think, and I couldn't resist asking this question because you're a professor and of marketing. First, what defines our understanding of globalization, and what I tell, and more importantly, what is this lure of globalization that everybody is looking for? And the second related question, I'm going to put both of them together so that they are related. You're an expert in consumer choices and consumer behavior and competitive strategies Ravi just read out. Is consumerism the essential driving force behind globalization? Is this the fuel that's driving business, or are there some other dynamics? I'll leave this to you.
Oh, thank you, Pankaj. Great questions. First of all, there is really no decline of globalization. It's re-globalization. There's no de-globalization. And fundamentally, it's happening on two dimensions where the governance of multilateral institutions are going to change their role. First of all, the trade, which is one dimension of globalization, is going from a multilateral to more and more bilateral trade. And that's because in the trade, compared to the old theory of David Ricardo, comparative advantage, where the notion was that more you specialize in one area, you'll have economies of scale and you have access to a bigger market. So you always advocated, why should British actually make bread anymore? We are an industrial nation. We can make bread making machines. Let Spain, which was more agricultural, make the bread, we buy from them, and they buy the machine. Balance of trade. There has been a significant imbalance of trade since the trade as a driver of globalization took place probably in about 30 years ago. Very key point. And in the process, you saw this uneven balances of trade, even within the NAFTA group, for example, for America, the surplus that Canadians had against the Americans, surplus that Mexico had also against America, and then China, of course, became a very big surplus as a nation, and everybody was buying from them. So that's clearly one problem. So the trade is getting redefined, a one dimension of globalization, to more bilateral. And that's very important change. And in the process, you will see reactions. Second one is that trade itself is shifting from trade to more and more investment as it used to be. So there'll be more shift from trade to investment. Just keep that comment. The third comment is something that economists have not talked about. Trade between nations used to be where separate entities will be trading. Today, the trade, especially with US, is about more than 50% of the American trade is within the same company. Intra-firm trading, as opposed to, which means same company makes one part here, ships it out the raw material that's counted as an export or import, does a little more value add in another country, et cetera, which is artificial trade. And that's very key to understand. Economists had no theory about that one. Nobody knows intra-company trading. And when you have a large conglomerate with interrelated businesses like the Mitsubishi Group, for example, in Japan, or Samsung Group, for example, in Korea, or Tata Group, for that matter, out of India, they can do within the firm across entities more trade than the trade, and that impacts the nations. Just keep that. Now, trade and investment are two different things. Trade has been there for thousands of years. Silk Road is a famous one where India was a juncture in many ways, where the Chinese silk will go to the Europeans and Europeans will give their products, whatever it is. So trade has been thousands of years. It's the investment side that's very key. And there are 6 flows on which the two dimensions change, which is where the debate is. Here are the 6 flows. The flow of products, which is definitely changing right now. Flow of people, which is the labor mobility, that's changing dramatically actually, with anti-immigration laws and populism movement everywhere. Europeans are as much concerned about the refugees who are coming from, let's say, Northern Africa or someplace, Syria, et cetera, as America is concerned, as, everybody's concerned about. So people mobility, which is a labor. The third one is money. Money is not as impacted as the people and the product mobility. And we think of globalization from the viewpoint. Those 3 are now getting redefined. But there are 3 additional flows which are continuing. The flow of diseases is actually more globalizing than ever before. And we see COVID-19 pandemic as a clear case. Most of the distribution or diffusion of the diseases is because of the travel between countries. Passengers from one country bringing the virus through other country and spreading. So contagion theory is very important. So diseases will remain global. There is no re-globalization. Second area is technology. Technology is definitely getting more and more global. Think about Zoom, we are using it, how quickly it became a global platform. So that's not re-globalization, it's just expansion of globalization. And the last area is very interesting, which is what I just defined as a culture. Consumption culture is definitely continuing to globalize no matter where you are. And that is where Rudyard Kipling in 1800s, as you know, he was born and brought up in India. And he had this famous saying, he was very loyal to India actually, but he always advocated that in his ballad, East is East, West is West, and the twain shall never meet. He is dead wrong. First of all, he is dead, we know, but he's wrong also. Because today, westernization of the Asian children in Japan, South Korea, China, India is incredible. Now, for the first time, you see Easternization of the world taking place. Who would have imagined that in the last 1 decade alone, yoga will become a global event? Everybody will adopt yoga and meditation out of India. So Easternization in spirituality, Easternization into traditional wellness thinking, Ayurveda kinds of medicines are coming back from allopathy, which is an interesting one. So culture, as I call it, or consumption culture, continues to remain more global despite all of the restrictions, pretty much. So out of the 6 flows, 3 flows is what is happening and in terms of anti-globalization, and we talk about it. The other 3 flows, actually, it is continuing to happen. So I will stop here and you can ask me second question.
Yeah.
And you can go answer.
No, it's
continue.
Thank you, Professor Shed. I think it's interesting, what you just say. There's a traditional notion of globalization through flow of products and people and technology, but you added the interesting culture part to it, which is dramatically changing how we see value in ideas coming from different parts of the world. But let me, we'll come back to these 2 segments in some ways, but let me start by the first set that you laid out, which is the product, people, money, and there have been some strains in globalization for some decades, and not only one, but maybe a couple of decades. And let me point out some markers. Many people have written about it, that inequality is on the rise, and so is protectionism. While I was thinking about this, I looked at the recent UNCTAD World Investment Report, which says that FDIs have not returned to even the pre-2008 levels. The World Trade Report says that there was slower growth in trade over the last decade. Economies are 10 times more restrictive today, and it's been increasing. I'm not talking about right now, but it's been increasing for some time. They're more restrictive today than a decade ago. Tariffs in countries like India have gone up dramatically over the last 6 years than in the last decade. So that's one world. On the other hand, the Davos men and women, as Sam Huntington very nicely puts it, would say otherwise. I wonder, what is your assessment on this part of the state of globalization? What do you think may have been happening around here?
Okay. If you look at the current globalization, it is only about 30 years ago. Prior to that one, we always had the GATT agreements, General Agreement of Trade and Tariff. for import and export of products. Certain industries were protected by the nations of origin. They did not want competition to come in their own nations. They wanted local national enterprises as the national champions for certain industries to protect that industries. And therefore, there are restrictions about imports, that the expansion about exports, etc. So every country had tariffs. We found that, unfortunately, economies were not growing after the first energy crisis. Very important marker next to probably Great Depression, in fact, more than Great Depression. I've done a lot of analysis on the structural changes of 74 to 78 energy crisis created by strictly price increase. Three nations who controlled at that time 70% of the capacity of oil from $1.25 raised it to $4.50 created a huge economic shock. At that time, the people of the world, leaders of the world decided that anything you do domestically is not going to be helpful, that bilateral trade or multilateral trade, they remove the guardians essentially, instead put the WTO regime, more free flow, and 30 years it lasted, but it had consequences. Many countries decided to outsource their industries. Fault is not the governments, but the private enterprises. For example, many American companies globally competitive, so we'll have our garment industry go outside the country. We will not make garments here because it's very labor intensive. So it went to South Korea at one time, surprisingly. Taiwan made clothes, they got out of it. Now, of course, it's Bangladesh as a concentration, which had an impact on jobs. So one of the biggest problems was we did a great outsourcing, downsizing, right sizing. And unfortunately, a lot of things are blamed on globalization, but really what happened was we did huge automation. Take the automobile industry, which was run by people primarily. Machines were sort of electromechanical, but we invested heavily into robots. Now here's the consequence on a corporation, which people don't understand. General Motors, as the largest corporation in the world at one time, or automotive sector in general, had this belief system that automobile industry will continue growing. So for every retiring General Motors worker, there are supposed to be 8 or 9 new workers who will contribute toward the premium for pension plans. Today, for 8 or 9 retired workers for whom they have an obligation to pay pension and healthcare forever, there is only 1 new factory worker. And we do not ask robots to join unions. We do not ask robots to have a labor union membership. Nobody's charging any tax. So that's why GM had to declare bankruptcy. The obligation of the past contracts, they cannot sustain. And it happened with airlines the same way. After the energy crisis, airlines all nosedived. We opened up airline wholesale deregulation under President Carter. 70 airlines died within 2 years. A few survived. And every one of them had huge obligations. And the best one we may remember in India was Pan Am. Pan Am was a world-class airline, but could not sustain. But they had lifelong obligations, no new employees. So only way out was to declare Chapter 11. Chapter 11 protection, where shareholder value goes out, the judge decides who will get what paid, and the creditors take over the company essentially. Keep that in the back of your mind. Back to the other side, there is a big consequence of globalization, especially in India with our liberalization in 1991, which is mind-boggling. And I did a session on the future of capital and capital markets, cities. I'm absolutely astounded. I still am trying to figure out whether my numbers are right or not. But we created unprecedented wealth. It's not the income disparity, which is what economists have looked at, called the Gini score.
Right.
Wealth disparity is even much greater. And here are the numbers. The largest wealth today is owned by private individuals, not by the sovereign states or by foundations or by institutions. You know how much it is? $160 trillion.
Okay.
Personal wealth. We have created 20 million millionaires in the last 3 decades. 20 million millionaires. We have created more than 2,000 billionaires, mind-boggling wealth. That $60 trillion thing, no hands-on whatever is generated $16 trillion of additional wealth, which is bigger than, and that's concentrated by, of course, globally, but into the handful of people, which is creating a huge debate about not corporations as much, which they made the wealth through, let's say, Jeff Bezos right now in Amazon, which is the wealth, or the Walton family, Walmart, which is as a family, are about $120 billion wealth and increasing every year. What to do about that one? Is it sustainable? Or just like in the old days when you had a very rich nation, empire, others won't attack them, right?
Yes.
For their possessions is going to be a physical. My worry is that just we see the protest against governments today, next will be protest against corporate headquarters. It is that bad.
No, I think what a wonderful story that you've told us. And I'm not surprised why the Davos men and women are not necessarily wanting the system to change in any which way. And but I just want to add for all our members of the audience here. You talked about auto, and the most interesting thing is the tourism, which is one of the biggest powers behind that cultural globalization that you talked about. And its force in terms of building global sensibilities. And it's actually a far higher contributor to global output than auto itself.
Correct. Very true. You're so right. Tourism is usually about 15 to 20% of an economy. And of course, if you are a tourist country like small islands in Pacific, or like Fiji Island, for example, or islands in Caribbean, for example, it's 90% of their income pretty much. India is a very fascinating data because we are having this conversation with Indian audience. I did a whole session on the Indian tourism. And again, the numbers are so different than our perceptions. In India, before the COVID, we had 1.3 billion tourists, B as in boy. I said numbers are not right. You can't believe these numbers. But Indians do travel within the country. Vast majority, other than 15 million, are all domestic travelers because of the religious festivals, Mela, traveling in fact for wedding attendance and doing some tourism. It's a very large market. India is a very large market, but it is still not automated. So my recommendation has been, in tourism, you do two things to really make it big, because government believes tourism is a very important industry, which I totally agree. I'm talking about domestic alone. First of all, every job in tourism that touches the customer, the tourist, should be completely certified. It is highly unorganized sector. How do you make it organized? And make it very technology intensive so that the left hand knows the right hand in a real time. Today it's a relay system as a tourist. When I go, cell phones are ringing, but nobody knows what they are doing. So I'm held hostage as a tourist properly. Many other countries have done a great job. I mean, Africa has done a great job. When you go to Kenya and those areas, or South Africa, tourism is a major industry for them. I think one can learn quite a lot. That will attract foreign tourism in India. India has more capabilities for tourism than most other countries because we have the heritage sites on the one hand, based upon our culture, religion. We have artifacts, which I mean, you digitize the whole city of Ahmedabad, as a part of the project for UNESCO. It's mind-boggling capabilities, but they are not properly maintained and managed. And then we are creating the new monuments, like the Statue of Unity, like our Liberty Statue, which is an attraction for tourism. So it just goes on and on. I'm very fond of tourism as an industry personally. And so I do believe tourism is a good spark. Oh, by the way, also, I'm sorry to belabor with numbers. largest tourists used to be Americans, mostly going up. Not very popular. Now it was surpassed by Japan. Today, the largest tourists are Chinese.
Indeed.
Period.
Indeed.
China government has encouraged their people to go out, not only Southeast Asia, but to India. And most of these tourists, like Indian tourists, when they go abroad, they bring their culture with them. There's a chef or a cook that goes out. If you go to cruise ships, again, there'll be Indian meal made for you.
Right.
Every culture has their own biases, right? And I think that's what we have to understand, how to cater multicultural ethnic groups in tourism. But tourism is a key industry.
No, very, very interesting. I'm also kind of want to bring you back onto this conversation on the on institutions, and you talked about capital flows and inequality.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if this globalization was waiting for a pandemic to bring out its inherent weakness in its own model, and in the movement of global capital, its influence. I mean, this inequality grew, as you mentioned, during this period, with enormous amount of wealth being created individually. I mean, we are in very, very strange times. And I just wonder, with so many institutions globally that have been at the forefront of global governance and G20 and many others, why did you think these countries, which had so much of stake in each other, absolutely did not cooperate on the pandemic? I mean, where did this global mindset, global world and everything just vanished? I mean, you saw Brexit, I mean, completely tearing apart conversations in EU, and pandemic seems to have put a wedge in there.
Yeah, no, you're so right. In many ways, one key change is a political turmoil. People are fed up with their own governments, whoever they are, and with their own leaders. So they're going out of the way as more and more economies or nations become democratic. Let's say Soviet Union collapse, and they put their own form of democracy. Whatever form of democracy you have, they want to revolt against through going to the polls and voting. Out of nowhere, unknown people have become leaders, and they've formed a new party, as you saw in Italy, for example, as you see in Spain, as you see in Eastern European countries. Populism has risen to a level that people never expected, which means the existing incumbent parties somehow did not manage the change for the future for their own survival. True in Argentina, true in Brazil for that matter. Mexico has gone through that. I mean, I can give you every example from any kind of an economy in the world. I think that is the fault of the incumbent parties. They did not know. They were just being complacent. You know, it's like why good institutions fail. This is one of the things. They became arrogant, and they were unwilling or unable to change with times. Key trigger for all this, surprisingly, is not what we think about. It is the social media. Social media has created a spark today. A little event happening in a small town can remain there in a small town and nobody would know. But today that event immediately is on a global news front and it amplifies. So globalization of social media, or technology as I call it, has been a key factor. In fact, we have scholars who said, how did the revolt happen in Poland against the Soviet system? It was sneaking in basically video cassettes. Because every other media was banned, radio was banned, etc. But you did have these illegal things that came in pretty much. So that's clearly one factor in my view. I think that populism movement will continue till the governments understand and become more and more people-centric in many ways, you know, citizen-centric, whatever form of democracy or autocracy you have. Remember in the old days, we had some great emperors who were great listeners to the people.
Right.
They will go out in incognito and watch what people are doing, observe. They were great listeners and they did very well. Then you had a ruthless, you know, emperor. So it has nothing to do with the form of government. It is to the form of leadership. There is the leader willing to listen to their people and adapt himself or herself in the party or the institution, which is a problem. Now I can come to the pandemic and WHO. Unfortunately, the pandemic thing has nothing to do with what we think about. It is all about commerce and trade. There is a race going on, just as we have the streaming media race, just as we have the social media race between the big players, WhatsApp on the one hand, Facebook on the other hand, etc. And I'll come to that. Right now, there's a huge opportunity of creating this multi-billion-dollar industry. It's just like automobile wars in the early 1900s. America would like to create the de facto standard by using its market. Europeans would like to do the same thing, create their standard using their market. China is doing its own, so is Soviet Union, by the way. So right now they don't want to share. At WHO, you have to share quite a lot.
Right.
So this is just like any pharma product, any kind of a biogenetic product where you keep secret so much and you patronize the industry that is starting pretty much. So that's the key problem. Like anything else I mentioned, I still believe in my rule of three theory. Yeah. It happens again and again. I think there'll be shakeout mergers of all of these vaccine producers, and ultimately 3 vaccines will survive, probably more blessed by each of the governments in many ways. So cooperation with WHO will not happen for a while, it looks like, despite all the benefits of cooperating in a pandemic situation.
What a fascinating comment from you. I mean, looks like we are back. We need people like Mr. Hamid from CIPLA to break this deadlock and gridlock, as he did at the time of the HIV cocktail and so on and so forth. So there are probably a new set of very concerned entrepreneurs and individuals would emerge to somewhere take this into a more humane domain.
Oh, I agree. In fact, in one of my articles I wrote, I told that WHO will be so paralyzed with the controversies going on, we probably have to create another United Nations agency, which is totally focused on vaccine research, just vaccine alone, because WHO does everything highly focused where there is a cooperation, for whatever reason. The second problem, Pankaj, is more interesting. People don't realize that the old model of inventing patent protection, giving monopoly for X number of years is dead, it's old. It never works very well in the new generation because in a technology world, especially, I'm talking about the Silicon Valley technologies, the faster you diffuse the technology, the more global you do it, which requires cooperation, partnering. So I have always said, don't do protection. As soon as you invent something, license the world. You will make more money from royalty than you will make money about making the product, marketing the product, storing the product, servicing the product. It's a very hard thing to do. I can immediately become a global platform for a technology, a virus in this case, for example, by licensing the world and make money as a license royalty, just as we do on the books, for example. And that model still is not coming in the minds of the people.
Very interesting. It looks like the vaccine for COVID might have a direction of that particular kind. I want to move on a little bit. Professor Sheth, no globalization conversation can happen without talking about China.
Yes.
China is the poster child of globalization in many which ways. It built its capabilities over time. And as the demand for its production capabilities and its costs grew globally, it grew economically. And it grew in many which ways. It built its systems, infrastructure, manufacturing model, its cities. And it also, in all fairness, lifted many hundred million out of poverty. No two doubts about it today. What are some lessons from China's global strategy? We'll come to some of the negative part later, but what are some good lessons out of that process that we can take for the rest of the world, and especially India?
I think it's, first of all, making a commitment through policy that we will go from a feudal society, agricultural based manufacturing capability, and therefore have no things about what China is rising. When America began to outsource after Nixon alignment that took place, which is we needed cheaper labor. Labor was available in, and China basically said, in fact, if you look at the GDP of China today, even today, although it's slightly changing, probably 60% is all products made for foreign brands, both for the Chinese market, but absolutely export market. Everybody came there to make the products, so they supplied the raw materials. They gave them the technical know-how. They trained the Chinese workers, who are basically agricultural people, essentially, and certain cities. They gave them dormitories, etc. And China, because of the Hong Kong and Shenzhen nearby, had the logistics infrastructure in place. So I could export out. It's a value add, basically, you are doing, right? Just a value add. And Chinese were pragmatic enough to say, I don't care whether it's my brand or it is a foreign brand. I just need to do something transition. Now, who did that same thing? Surprisingly, Abraham Lincoln did the same in America after the Civil War.
Interesting.
If you look at the transition of the Americas, it's the same thing. Now, fortunately, America had no market because the Native Americans were all basically traditional people, and they did not go into modernization. It's all immigrants who came to make the factory work. They had to export quite a lot. So quite a lot of work in America was done by European companies. But the scale is much greater. Now Chinese are saying we are ready now to have our own brand names. China makes not just cheap quality, but all quality.
All quality.
Japan went through that thing.
Yes.
When I was growing up, we used to laugh at Japanese products, you know.
It was called Japani Mal.
Exactly. And then we used to laugh at Korea, same thing. South Korea did the same thing. And now it's China. So they began to invest in quality, in processes, some safety requirements also. And today they would like to have their own brands patronized because, and this is my key point, the soft power of a nation, while it comes also from culture, heritage, philosophy, religion, as ancient civilizations have, but the modern soft power of a nation comes from world-class brands it produces. American soft power came because we produced like a Ford Motor Company car. We produced Timex watches, Kodak, for example, either based on innovation or licensing, however you did it. It comes, Japanese change in the image in the world happened when they produced world-class products. Sony was the leader at one time. Toyota even today leads, for example, all the Zaibastos, as they call them. South Korea, backward country, certainly in 35 years, with vocational technical training, becomes middle income or a high income. So today Samsung commands respect worldwide. So does Hyundai, for example, LG Industries. They set standards to say, we will have the nation admired by outsiders through branding. Not the branding of the nation, but the branding of the companies who actually produce world-class products and compete successfully globally. And that is where China is heading. And I tell you, I just finished a book, Global Rule of Three. It'll come out as a policy. I'm amazed. Every industry I analyze, there is at least one global player who is Chinese. Lenovo in PC business,
yes,
Haier in appliances business,
right,
in steel, in aluminum. I mean, anything you look at it. And they are now asked by the government, most of them state enterprises, to go global as fast as you can.
Right. Very nice.
Which is creating a problem, right? Yeah.
Yes, and we'll come to it. But just on, and since you mentioned Zaibatsu, you know, looks like India is also creating its own Zaibatsus.
Yes.
In terms of a few people focusing, being kind of given that mandate to kind of build that industry exclusively in quite some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I think taking advantage of the large domestic market And key transformation of the Indian economy is that 60% or more consumption even today in India is unbranded, and 70% of the distribution is unorganized sector. In services, it's like 90% unbranded, except the newer technologies like cell phones or banks, etc. Given that situation, as the economy shifts from unbranded to branded consumption and from unorganized to organized retailing, India has a huge scale advantage. And when you do something at the consumer level, it has an impact in the value chain all the way back to the raw material.
Right.
So it's very important to focus. So for example, just as we created Amazon as an online retailer, and China has created Alibaba using cellular telephone platform, India can create one of the largest retailers in the world, which it looks like would be the Geo platform, because they've decided they will go from a cellular telephone to becoming an online retailer. And of course, with online, you can always have an offline buying somebody like Future Group they just bought or announced the buyout, the what used to call Big Bazaar, store
Right,
people,
Big
right?
Bazaar and everyone. That's
Yeah,
correct.
yeah, yeah.
The
So
challenge, of course, the challenge, of course, always is crony capitalism in this entire environment with Zaibatsus and the government coming in, and we need to be very, very careful about. But one other thing on China, I just want to know how much has China's strategy of globalization, and it has been globalizing very rapidly, whether we see in some parts of Asia, in our neighborhoods here in India, or in Africa and elsewhere. How much have those strategies played a role in denting global governance and global business, and also the role of these multilateral large institutions that were the glue for much of rules and regulation across the world to be followed?
No, you're a huge dent. Ian Bremmer wrote a great article in 2014. He was a UK minister, as you know. He runs the United Nations refugee issues. Very, very interesting human being. And he coined two phrases in that article, which I teach. He actually told that as we go forward toward 2020, we'll see what he called guarded globalization.
Very interesting.
Not the free globalization as we all encounter, like the Ricardo model of some sort, of free trade everywhere. And second thing he mentioned is that the world will go more towards state capital, which means states will be engaging their own resources, mostly capital, towards shaping certain corporations in many ways for their global ambitions primarily, right? I think those are coming pretty well. I've been very, very impressed how foresight he had in that area. Here is my view. It is very important, unfortunately, in a globalization that the government policy nurtures each country's globalization, their own interests, their own aspirations to rise. Most of this is that after World War II, if you look at the history, we had a very nice harmony called the triad power.
Right.
Kenichi Omai wrote a book. He also wrote a, Borderless World, another good book he wrote. He wrote trilogy very nicely. Brilliant man, still alive and all that stuff. His book Triad Power showed that as of 1987, world was various after World War II. America defeated Japan, therefore they could impose their views and values. America defeated Germany, and therefore Europe, they can impose their views and values. So the American idealism became the dominant platform, and there was a harmony. As of 1987, they built, through Bretton Woods, as you mentioned, institutions like IMF, World Bank, United Nations, and America led the way. But it's American perspective.
Right.
Europeans never bought it, by the way, for your information.
Right.
Continental Europeans never bought that argument because America is what I call cowboy capitalism. Allow market to engage in failure, even at the cost of the nation. Let the failure happen, and then only if the private free market cannot do it, we will bring in now the state help in some fashion. Europeans don't believe that. So here are the examples. We invented the cellular telephone in America. I was working on the project with Bell Labs to commercialize it. We lost it because we allowed every standard to take care. TDMA, CDMA, about 5 standards were competing. Let the market decide, which is what we believe in. Europe decided one standard, GSM, and the rest is history. Today, 90% or so is a GSM standard. You see what I'm saying?
Yes.
So free market, it may not be the right solution quite often, which is a problem, but world was well organized. Then you see collapse of communism, the rise of the cell phones and social media, huge transformation in the society. And now we have a new triad power arising. If you look at the purchasing power parity and the GDP, China is about $30 trillion. The United States is only about 26, 25 trillion, IMF data, and India is about 11, 12 trillion. The new triad power now is America, China, India, and they don't have the same view about the world. Capitalism. Democracy may be there, but China grew up as a communist nation, has different thinking and philosophy. Ours is, of course, the typical Leninist theory, mixed economy kind of a thing, commanding heights and all this stuff. And these three nations are the dominant consumer economies moving the world economy forward. So the new world order and the new triad power will go through a lot of bumps.
Mm-hmm. And I yeah, they have so jagged edges around them, and,
exactly.
and yeah, so I think that that makes me think. So what happens post pandemic? More
Yes.
on the ground, for instance, a few years
Yeah.
down the road, all of this starts to settle in. Where does global business go? I mean, is it going to be easy to set up business in different countries? Is it easy to follow or enforce rules of global regulation, transfer money, transfer data, even move manpower, which is turning out to be very, very complex at this particular juncture? And I wonder what happens to MNCs. What does multinational corporation would mean? Or are companies just going to sell at the borders because the supply chains are in phenomenal tatters at this point of time? The debate on reshoring and redundancy is all kind of, becoming very, very prominent. Lean manufacturing is being blamed for every problem today. And I just saw a BBC video, very interesting picture of how the metal 3D printer is actually in one shot producing products that are so complex that would have taken 20 processes if you were going the other way around. So what happens to businesses on the ground?
Very simple. The companies will remain the same, but the strategy would be to do more distributed manufacturing. If you're making things distributed, you don't rely on one destination because that has a more raw material advantage, labor advantage, etc. You provide distribution and you provide redundancy. So if there's a disaster in one geography, other geography can fill the disaster in for a short time till you pick up the capacity back. I actually did a future of manufacturing session, and I found out very interesting possibilities, because today, if you take the lean operations, for example, I can do mass customization at a much smaller scale.
Right.
Not even counting 3D technology.
Right.
Interestingly. Now add 3D technology, which at Wipro, we had a major presence in that area. I was advising. Very fascinating that 3D technology is at such a primitive stage, but it is likely to become more and more relevant as we go, right? So my view is that same company, but rather than exporting from one location, everything, you have to distribute, which means you have to invest into those key economies.
Right.
You can't invest all over the world. So you decide which countries you want to go after, where you have a geopolitical alignment. There's a friendship, for example, and you begin to invest selectively in those countries, which are your key markets, but the governments are aligned so that you don't have the problem of the governments changing their mind through policy, etc., etc. That is what we are looking at it. Can I add one more thing here?
Yes, please.
Surprisingly, there is such a strong sentiment worldwide, not limited to India, America, that you cannot depend on China for everything.
Right.
Here is the problem. It's nothing to do with technology. Today, we invented in America microwave oven. In the 80s, we couldn't sustain it, so we outsourced to Japan.
Right.
Japanese made all the microwave ovens, different brand names, General Electric, Whirlpool, whatever they are. Japanese decided to quit, South Koreans took over. Today, 94% of the world microwave ovens are made in China. They can shut you out and you will have a revolt in the family.
Very well said. Absolutely.
So,
One related question, I mean, multinational, their capital structure has also been changing for over years. You don't even know who owns how much and what. Do you think that may happen a little bit more through this distributed system that you're kind of talking about? We are seeing it in Reliance, so many companies around the world are wanting to have a piece of this Zaibatsu, if you may, in India, emerging one, if at all.
Yeah. In many ways, the model of capital structuring is going to be more like what Tata Sons has done. Tata and Sons is never traded, period. But it owns companies where they have a 30% and they are all traded.
Right.
And that is the new structure of capital coming in that I see probably more and more. Even in India, government enterprises can do the same.
Very, very interesting.
They never traded.
Right.
All can be under that one. They're all because with different customers, markets. Now in that parent company holding, I can invite capital from anywhere in the world.
Right.
It has all the flexibility of capital moving in and out. And that's the key advantage in India because we are just too many companies that needs to be consolidated first.
Right.
Either by market process, government even encouraging merger acquisitions, which is hard because most of these are family controlled, if not family owned companies. Right? That's a new structure that's coming in. And as I told you, that $160 trillion wealth, where is it managed? These are family offices.
Right, family office. That's
you have people who have so much money, they can create their own family investment offices, and they can make the play because there are no restrictions of a stock market.
Right.
So private equity, as it is called, I call it private wealth. It's the Swiss model, by the way. This is what happened in Switzerland when between World War I and World War II, the people were fleeing because of the wars. Their wealth was already given to Swiss people, to custodians manage, and out of which they began to fund what we call private equity market, essentially. Private capital. It's really private capital more so as opposed to stock market. I think that's going to call the shots in the future.
No, fascinating business history linked in this manner, Professor Shea. I think we're kind of coming to a close of this conversation because there are many questions that are already coming up. But I still have one last one, and I want to go back to understanding, about cooperation and countries. It looks like what has globalized in today's time is national interest, strong armed leadership. Almost very rarely do you find free market, low free trade, high protection, low equalization of opportunities, weak flow of capital globally, all leading to poor cooperation between nations. The pandemic is an example. G20 leaders met with their face mask on, sitting in their own countries and their offices, but have just not done anything together. So under what conditions would nations start to cooperate? I mean, it bothers me that we can't cooperate, but we want to go globalize.
Cooperation would not be global, but more regional. I don't mean geographically regional.
Okay.
The European Union had a great test with Brexit leaving. There was a huge worry that other nations begin to abandon the EU dream and the vision, which was basically stopping wars in Europe. United States of Europe, as Winston Churchill talked about. And of course, there is no major war possibility within the European Union, like World War I or World War II. They just got a confirmation at the last meeting with the leadership of Angela Merkel, especially supported by the French President Macron. It's very fascinating. They affirm that European Union will survive, whatever it takes. Now that's a huge block of nations, and they have their own satellite influences. Many of the former colonies, the French are still very loyal parent, like Lebanon, what you see right now. But it has been true in Haiti. There are good expansion. So there's a whole block of countries that see the world the same way. Then you have the other block of countries which are organizing themselves around China, please.
Right.
In fact, I just finished a paper, policy paper for my institute, India-China America Institute. I see Cold War II starting. I call it Cold War 2.0. That will be primarily a Cold War, no longer with Soviets and the Russians as we have it right now, but America Cold War with China. And that Cold War is very different. The old Cold War was on ideology, capitalism versus communism. The new Cold War will be all about economics, period. And the weapons you use will be very different rather than, the mission is very interesting in the new Cold War. I call it Cold War 2.0 because of technology. The mission is not to destroy you, but the mission is to paralyze you. I don't have to have your people killed in any battle, either proxy wars in other countries for my ideologies. It's all economics. I can just paralyze you sitting in a room. Cyber attacks. I build infrastructure like the BRI to tie up the nations much more closely, as the British did at one time, much more closely, so that you cannot get out of the relationship because it's now hardwired from an infrastructure viewpoint. It's very important. You know, trade, I can have tariffs and I can slow down the flow. Here it's much harder. So BRI is a major initiative, and that is what we are watching about around here. So it goes from hardware-oriented Cold War to software-oriented Cold War.
Very interesting. You know, looks like there is I mean, by the arguments that you make, I mean, there's a possibility of a new Iron Curtain falling down, and mobility of people and everything will then also be affected. Both capital as well as people will get affected in this process.
And absolutely. One of the software-based technology, very important, will be used is social media, which is why we have the debates about the Chinese-based apps, for example. TikTok is a point of poster boy of kind of a battleground. Right. You will see more and more of those. There will be trade, and it's very interesting battleground, and the weapons are very different. Okay. And then you have the hard power to soft power. That is going to change quite a lot. So what will happen is that this world will be multilateral governance rather than a unilateral governance is a key difference we see. And there always will be skirmishes among those 3-4 blocks that are created. There is still a Russian bloc out there. We are watching very carefully because I do believe President Putin is more strategic leader in the world in shaping the world than we have realized.
Right. Do you think that these kind of larger groupings may also lead to a little bit more reduction of poverty, increase in inequality a little bit, or it's anybody's guess at this juncture?
It's a guess, but I tell you, fundamentally, we see more and more power. Government becomes more an fund, but the role still like the Bill Gates Foundation kinds of companies or foundations, but the personal wealth of the individuals. So Warren Buffett and Bill Gates say half of our wealth, we will give it for social purposes, and they will get organized. They are not ad hoc mob, but the movement is taking place. Azim Premji in India, for example, says, all my wealth, I will give it to the society purposes rather than family wealth continuing for the next generation, etc. These are the kinds of things that are happening. You see the private capital guys, you have to watch companies like BlackRock and Blackstone, not the investment bankers like Goldman Sachs anymore. And those have just started funds called ESG, environment, matching with the United Nations Sustainability Goals, ESG is performing quite well. So all debate that if I serve the society, I will not be able to serve the shareholders, that is gone. It's not either or proposition. I can do both at the same time. And BlackRock has publicly announced that we will not invest our capital. It's all private capital that's dominating the next decade. So you have to go to them. They're saying unless you are compliant with ESG. So
Okay.
ESG funds are doing very well. I'm sorry, I'm belaboring the point too much.
No, I think this is so fascinating listening to you, because you're covering business at one end, government and geopolitics at the other, society, inequality, and really we don't know where these powers seem to be moving, because there's so much of movement that's happening in terms of global governance, decision making, countries aligning, companies starting to play the role. One, I want to go to the question, but I'm still tempted to ask one other thing from you. What do you think of this Scandinavian model? Because that's also in some ways an interesting block. It has many of the characteristics that you mentioned of the state and everybody, and it has slightly lesser inequality than what it is there, even in Europe.
Yeah. Scandinavia always had a strong belief that unless you have maintained a middle class society, no matter what the economy changes, from raw material export to manufacturing, etc., and it kept up very well. I have a very strong view that values of these are not shaped as much by government as by families. We says that traditional societies with strong anchored values that came from historically thousands of years ago, how do you undo it? You have to unlearn those things, because most of the prejudices and the biases come in the early socialization of the child before they even go to the school. And then schools perpetuate those same biases against or for classes of people. It does not change at all. Surprisingly, it is more and more reinforced. So ultimately, when I become an adult, I hardwire those values. So when I look at somebody else who is of a different culture, I already have a preconceived notion. So ultimately, change has to happen at a family level. And this is a very strong belief in Scandinavia. Families behave, and I lived in Denmark for a year in 1976 during the first energy crisis. And there's not a given manager who says, I will go out of my way to do deceptive advertising or deceptive practices, because he is brought up with the view deception is fundamentally wrong. Brought up with the view by the family, not by the government. You see, we rely too much on the government to shape our values. I don't buy that argument, because then it can become very much like a propaganda, very much like shaping ideology. I can basically, so I personally believe that traditional societies will have to unlearn quite a lot and think about the future societies, which is where surprisingly the young generation with social media is disconnecting with their own parents. If you see family debates today in India or people of Indian origin here, the children do not accept some of the belief systems that the family or the parents were brought up themselves. So ultimately, change will happen within the family itself primarily, where the next generation does not accept the previous generation's view because so heavily influenced by social media, what we do in the high schools, for example, as an intervention to remove all those prejudices. And this is where Scandinavia has an advantage because it's relatively homogeneous society. And the immigration has been very selective. Swedish immigration is such that you allow immigrants, but you do not make a ghetto out of them. All stay in a neighborhood with each other. They basically integrate them over like 2-3 years. They have to learn the Swedish language. They're scattered into smaller towns, and therefore they are behaving in a way, become Scandinavian in many ways, kind of a notion. And therefore you don't have this multicultural hotbed of tensions, pretty much. So I do believe system is very good. I have experienced myself in Denmark. As soon as I came in there, this the government knew who I am, immediately said, you have to come to the clinic for complete examination, totally free. I would have never thought of doing it. So I had to go and get complete examinations. They think it's interesting for the government to do prevention in you because you'll be a burden on the society.
Sure. Okay, Ravi, I think we've kind of gone a little bit beyond. I couldn't resist the temptation of such fascinating perspective that we were hearing from Professor Sheth. What do you want me to do? You want to read out the questions and go ahead, or you?
Yeah, no, don't worry about the time. This was so engaging for everyone. And hopefully we will have Professor Sheth's generosity for if we run over time by 5 or 10 minutes, I hope. So what I could do is maybe start off with one or two questions I see on chat, and while Pankaj, maybe you can look through others and then pick up questions directly if you want.
Why don't you start, and I have a few in mind, or I can start if you want.
So one question I think is an important one from Professor Murari Jha. He's a professor at Ahmedabad University. His question, to kind of paraphrase and summarize, he's saying that with globalization, there have been obviously unintended consequences like poverty, income disparity, lack of healthcare, destruction of environment. And social media has linked people across the world and to share concerns about these problems like never before. How long do you think it will take for capitalism to wake up to these brewing crises? Can we hope for a reform of capitalism from within, or will there be a forced reform from outside with popular movements and, God forbid, violence? Yeah, either of you, Professor Sheth or Professor.
I mean, a very good question, first of all.
Yeah.
Yeah. You want me to answer, Pankaj?
Sure, please. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. It's very, very important question. I wrote a book along with Raj Sisodia called Forms of Endearment, which led to conscious capitalism. Along with the founder of Whole Foods, John Mackey, who believes the same way. We wrote up about Whole Foods. I had no idea what the company is all about, etc. The book is still selling very well. And Raj Sisodia is full-time now into conscious capitalism movement himself, which has now led to a huge impact. At the last Business Council in 2019, 200 CEOs affirmed their belief system, environment is important. They affirmed that governance is important. So to me, it is getting acceptance by the capitalists themselves, which is a very key point. If they still don't listen toward reducing the inequality, which is a very key trigger point, you always have a revolt in a society. If you look at the history of revolts in China, they call them peasants because it was all agreed. They can't take it anymore. Ultimately, they say, I want to show my power through masses. As we saw in India, Gandhi, in a non-violent way, showed through marches, if I can harness millions of people, there is no army that can stop them, period. You just can't control it. And that's my biggest worry, and I propagate the idea that what is happening in front of government buildings today in America, the next target would be corporate headquarters. It did happen. Prakash Sethi, who is one of my former students, a well-known guy, wrote a book Up Against the Corporate Wall in the 70s when Kodak as a corporation wanted to break the unions. So this is the old thinking, and this is again, I'm sorry to take this platform to talk about, because the capitalism as we know today is only 30 years old, shareholder obsession, since again that 74, 78 crisis. Good families, when they went into smaller towns, all great corporations started in smaller towns. They live in the community. Every Sunday in American system, church is a great equalizer. You get more respect. Your neighbors are your managers. Their children play with your children. You have a lot more connectivity with the society. Your suppliers now come with you because you are a big, like Whirlpool Corporation in Benton Harbor, Michigan, where I observed this thing, Kohler in making toilet appliances, for example. It's very true. General Electric began that way. biggest problem arose with so long as the headquarters remain in a small town, like Caterpillar in Peoria, for example. I mean, just histories all over industrial revolution in England, in Germany, as well as in America, everything was fine because they thought about more holistic contribution enterprise or the family can make to the society. Unfortunately, for the sake of growth, they began to go and relocate headquarters in capital markets. Now we are a New York company, or New York, Connecticut, New Jersey. Only stakeholder you see is the investor and the analyst because you're closer to them. You forget about all of the stakeholders. They are out of sight, out of mind. I'm not kidding, true. And therefore, those companies became so much shareholder obsession. And you see the painful story at the end. General Electric, a great corporation, becomes so much shareholder obsession under Jack Welch, continues the legacy, destroys the company on the way out. There is no company that can survive long-term unless it is community-oriented at the same time, because society gives them so much resources. They give you the land, they give you access to the waterways, which is a river. You pollute the rivers, etc., etc. You owe something to the society that the society has given you, just like one more stakeholder. This is so true. Finally, they are understanding this thing, and
so true.
It's very important.
Yeah, Professor Sheth, Ravi, I just want to add something. You know, what you talked about companies and the community is also true about cities and countries. What happened in India at the time of the pandemic with large scale movement of migrant labor from cities is an example, same example of a community not necessarily coming together. And governments, so until unless I'm just actually paraphrasing some of the questions here about, until unless you have a government of certain kind, you have a community and society of a certain kind, what will happen to labor? What will happen to its mobility? What will happen? Who will care for this group of people once the pandemic gets lifted up?
Yeah. Like any major catastrophe, like a war, there's always a transition time period. As we suffered during partition, for example, as World War II people have suffered. I'm a refugee because of the Japanese invasion in Burma, for example. We lost everything. There's a transition time period, but ultimately people know that humans, labor is an asset. In fact, several people that I've been talking to in India, especially in Bombay area, are saying, I need those laborers to come and work in my factories. They're all small and medium enterprises. So they're now realizing the value of that labor in some fashion. The best way to get the labor value out, surprisingly, is automation. Absolutely contrarian view than you think. The worst labor humans use in terms of abuse is agriculture. It's the hardest job you ever do is in agricultural bonded labor, especially. Now, when you industrialize, the labor becomes much more surprisingly controlled. You are doing activity in a more controlled environment. You are not at the mercy of a boss, etc. In many ways, so factory wages go up, but at the same time, working conditions got better. Now you go to the knowledge economy. So one of the key things I'm strongly advocating in India, don't remain low-tech, ancient way of doing things. For example, our agriculture is way behind. We have to modernize the agriculture, so the wage of that agricultural worker will go up enormously. Unfortunately, the existing system would prefer the status quo. So you need a policy intervention or a civil society intervention to bring about that change. This is very important. Jamindari, we call it, okay? This is very important. So as we go to the knowledge worker, so my view is that today in the knowledge industry, we should have an aspiration to come on $100 per hour wage as a revenue. Why $5, $7, for example, for call centers? That's low technology. India is very good in high engineering technology. We don't want to be mass producers, cheap quality, cheap products. It's a waste of national resources. How do you make that very high? as it is true in Southern America, by the way, Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, same message. More automation is actually good for the labor as opposed to the traditional economic theories. Labor has never been displaced by automation. It has been amplified. They've always found something better to do. There is always a transition time period. I'm a very strong advocate that skills, this is a key problem in India. We don't have respect for labor. Anybody who does manual work like sanitation workers, we look down on them as a society. So vocational technical training is a very important platform. The National Education Policy Platform, I think, has thought through very well. Every country has come out in industrialization with better quality work, better quality of standard of living, etc., through that process. And now in a knowledge economy where we are, and let me make a last comment. I mean, I'm so positive about India, despite all of the things that we see as a problem. For the first time, the immigration policy in America or in Europe says you cannot send workers to us, IT professionals. So work has to come to you. So if I want to have gold, where do I go? Where there's a gold mine, by definition. So all the large corporations, Facebook, Google, Oracle, IBM, Accenture, are all now shifting work worldwide into India. Not to just serve American clients, but worldwide clients. Ernst & Young in Hyderabad alone has in one location 50,000 people working. I was told Oracle has just built on a build, turn, operate, BOT model, 1.2 million square foot headquarters there in Hyderabad. All the multinationals are coming in India because it's where people are, and people are not allowed to travel abroad. So there's all kinds of interesting things that are happening. You see now the investment by Facebook, Google announces, IBM will be a major announcement. It's a matter of time, I can assure you. So is Amazon investing, because not only is the market here excellent, same in state of Georgia. Silicon Valley, oh, people don't want to live there anymore, despite great weather. So Northern California, people are all moving to Austin, Texas, or companies are moving or coming to Georgia. We are capturing the talent. Just to see you out of this surprises. We are actually, I'm sorry to belabor, but we are the largest film producer city in the world now. Surpassed Hollywood. Mind-boggling, because we have the talent here. It's interesting, yeah. I'm sorry to belabor the point again. I'm so sorry. I'm so passionate about India.
That's very interesting perspective. So, and cutting across both at the business level and the country level. Ravi, you have a few more questions that you want to do, or?
Yeah, if Professor Sheth agrees, because we are past time, but if you have 5 minutes, Professor, we
can. I can have one. I will make my answers short, so you have more questions.
Your answers are so engaging. So please, if you can, if you have the time, we have the time. So, can I? As they say, who has the microphone gets to ask the question. So can I squeeze in one of my questions?
Yes, please.
I have control over the microphone at the moment. And it's not so much a question, but building on what you have talked earlier about soft power, and you just mentioned about Bollywood having overtaken Hollywood. Your definition of soft power, you were talking about soft power as in corporations, Sony and McDonald's or whatever, building the country's globalization through branding. If we take it one step forward into soft power of the kind like Hollywood, Bollywood, yoga in India, K-pop from Korea, are these maybe the future ways of doing globalization? Because these can't be stopped by walls that countries are trying to build physically or metaphorically. So are these kind of soft power the future of world cooperation, you think?
Absolutely. I totally agree. Power is not just product brand names, but culture brand names, things that you do where people are very interested. Today, given the virtual world, I can organize sitting in India many of the events where the Indian pop stars, Hollywood, Bollywood people, but they have to have a global mindset, not the ethnic mindset to say, I'm a great movie star, let me go worldwide with Indian ethnic population, about 30 million, whatever they are, which is the extension they do right now. They come here, live programs. We attend quite a few of those programs of, live concert type things. They have to think about how do I reach non-Indian population. Now, here is what we are doing. And again, I'm sorry to use this platform to mention live. Jainism is a great religion. It is overshadowed by Buddhism worldwide, which is a true global religion, by the way. I'm told that about 10 million Christians are all changing to Buddhism, religion they are born in, they don't find the meaning in life, both in Europe as well as in America. Jainism is equally a very interesting religion. So we have taken a stand as civil societies. How can we spread the beliefs of the fundamental philosophies of Jainism, not only non-violence alone used for social activism, but there are several very key concepts which are so meaningful in today's world, all meant for non-Indian population. We are a minority here, very small, tiny minority. Unless the majority believes and accepts that behavior, you can never get integrated or respected or admired. We have done very well in the academic world. Indian talent in academic world, from science, like public health right now, that is, all the top people coming out are of Indian origin. Great education they got in India, but the mainstream non-Indian population has accepted them. We can do the same thing with our culture, appealing to ourselves. So we are doing it right now. In fact, the group of people already has 11 or 12 endowed chairs on Jainism, all managed by our all shareholders are all non-Indians. It's interesting. World is ready. The Western world is searching for meaning in life. With events taking place now with the COVID and everything else, suddenly triggering to say, I need something else to keep me calm. I need some other framework. And it's all coming from the East. Fortunately, we are at a great advantage position because coming from China is somehow not trusting anymore. So the only other source of the ancient civilization that one can talk about how relevant it is today, surprisingly, is out of India. Our Vedantas have given so much of knowledge, not just for us to repackage for ourselves, which we should do, but spreading that knowledge worldwide. It's fascinating. So to me, I think it's very possible. So I do believe that culture, pop culture, or non-pop culture, can be a major influencer.
There's another question, interesting one, though slightly orthogonal from Ravi's question, and it has to do again with the organizations and groupings. What happens to ASEAN? What happens to RCEP? What happens to NAFTA, the new NAFTA, and all kinds of things in this new world of globalization?
Right, yeah. I have actually talked about this 3 to 4, maybe more than that. I worry that ASEAN cannot survive as a bloc. I have basically given my position to the government of Singapore, which is a key holder, that ASEAN bloc maybe not remain as unified as it could be. Largest trade bloc actually is in Asia. If you count India, China, Japan, South Korea, ASEAN is the largest trade bloc, bigger than European Union. And there's a lot of potential still to grow. It is a growth engine. Asia is a growth engine. But there are now outsiders who would like to interfere and try to divide that. So Malaysia has its own agenda. Indonesia may have its own agenda. Philippines may have its own agenda. And they will come in that Cold War that I talked about, Cold War 2.0, China on the one hand and US on the other hand. And they will try to divide that ASEAN bloc. So I think ASEAN bloc is very vulnerable right now compared to other blocs. Most solid is European Union because they have a unified currency. They're unifying military also at the same time. So once you unify military and unify currency, you have a lot more integration of the nations, across different cultural things, as we have done in India, for example. So currency is a very key aspect, right? Pretty much. So to me, a European Union will be more stable going forward despite the Brexit issue, where currency was different. Think about that. And then, by the way, just as a side comment, Brexit will be definitely aligning with America in a big way. Will be one of the largest partners with the United States, not European Union. And in the process, England comes out, Australia will come out, Canada comes out, and India will come out. India will benefit from Brexit much more than we realized. So that's happening. So, but the bloc that is most vulnerable is ASEAN. And South Latin America has a Mercosur that is also in disarray because Brazil was supposed to lead and Brazil has its own leadership problems.
Okay. Ravi? We can't hear you. You're on mute, I think.
We are stretching Professor Sheth's generosity, but one good question I see, a lot of the questions were related to labor migration, labor movement. I think in one way or the other, they've all been addressed mostly. But this last question that Pankaj mentioned about blocks like ASEAN was from Satya Dash. And Satya Dash has one other interesting question. He says that in the 1970s and 80s, Japan was the poster child of globalization. We don't hear about Japan very much now. So he's asking both professors, what do you see the role of Japan in the next 2 decades?
Pankaj, go ahead.
No, I think Japan has some very intrinsic strengths. I think manufacturing capabilities in a very, very interesting way. We've seen Japanese culture, its sense of ecology, its preservation of culture within the modern environment. I think all of those are amazing strengths that Japan carries. In my mind, and I think we have a colleague Keta here. We should listen to him as well. But my feeling is that Japan has to get its young people's mind right. I think that world is little bit as if unshepherded in many ways, and I think there's so much of potential there. On the other hand, Japan needs very big markets for it to grow at the pace and at the level of its, livelihood, etc., that it deserves. So Japan will have to partner with larger economies, and India is a very good partner, will be a very good partner for Japan in times to come, no two doubts about it. But maybe we should listen to Keta also, and Professor Sheth, you should give your worldview on this one.
Yeah, maybe Keta, you do it first, and then Keta, if you are still here. Keta is our resident Japanese at the university, so we'll get Keta in, but Professor Sheth first, yeah.
Are you sure, Ravi? Keta should go first.
Keta, you're there?
Yes, yeah.
On popular demand from Western India.
Yes.
No, Japan wasn't rising again, but Japan is Asian society first.
Yes.
So I mean, Japan and India, they had a good bilateral relationship, but then current prime minister, he just stepped down because of the medical reason. So I don't know. I'm kind of curious how our relations is going to change too.
Right.
Thank you so much.
I must tell you, Japan is one of my favorite nations. Almost in the same part as Scandinavia, maybe a little better. Japan is a society, because of the historical reasons, has really transformed itself as a nation that continues the tradition, a family tradition, and being very modern at the same time. Most of the nations make a jump one way and they forget the legacy and the history in many ways. It's a very proud nation. It's a nation that believes it can do things at the grassroots level, surprisingly, because I used to go very regularly to Japan from 1968, always hosted by Nikkei Institute and other people. And so I've always watched that. Japan's issue has been, as I think Kato mentioned, aging of the population. And for whatever reason, historically, they decided they will have a population control on the one hand, under emperor command, because of the advice by the foreigners, but also keep the society more homogeneous. They did not encourage immigration. Because worry was Koreans will move over, for example, nearby. Indonesians may come in nearby countries, Filipinos, etc. And instead, they delayed that so long. Now they have encouraged, about 1.2, 1.3 million people are working, settling. There is one Indian who has become a citizen. They had all the restrictions. I think it's a little too late because every month there'll be fewer Japanese men than last month. There's nothing they can do. Older Japanese men dying is much faster than they can reproduce anymore. They under-leverage the talent in just staring at them about women. US was forced to have the women talent take over the factories to run with just high school education during World War II because there were no men. Japan still, because of the tradition society of the role of women, did not allow women to come up to the level in terms of leadership roles, running the corporations. And that has been, now they're recognizing. Hopefully transition will take place in the process. Japan's future lies in the short run by non-Japan nations, by definition. China is not going to be, despite all the things, trading partner China is a big one, but they're trying to distance like Australia is trying to distance right now. And Japan definitely is looking at India as one of the very key destinations to align on both sides. Do not underestimate the technical talent of the Japanese. In the COVID phenomenon, there may be a vaccine coming out of Japan, like Samsung Corporation, which is Korean, but there are similar ones, Fuji, for example. I went there, one of the prefectures, and really looked at nearby Tokyo, the whole healthcare industry, which is their focus. Japanese have done very well over time, 3 sectors targeting, like the British economy, to the next more value add, next more value add. So they have a plan that seems to make sense. Unfortunately, like anything else, politics comes in the way, globalization comes in the way, but Japan is very much a great, great nation who can do wonderful things. Alignment with India will be not only infrastructure, which is where Japanese are very good, but also with defense. You do have now Australia, Japan, India, and America as a whole to Pacific, Southern South China Sea, etc., which is interesting. So suddenly the relationship with India will become strategic, more so militarily, not just market relationship. Japanese have done very, very well in Africa. If you go to Africa today, Land Rover is pushed out by Toyota. All of the safari guys have used Toyota. We talked to the drivers and they've praised Japanese Toyota car better than they praised Land Rover, for example, which was a historical British legacy there. I can give you examples. Japanese, because they don't speak English as we do commonly, they are not as aware, like Russians, same way. Russia has a good capability. So I'm very, very, very much fond of Japanese culture, Japanese people, the way they made the transition. But Pankaj, your point is very true. The next generation, how do you keep them 1 foot in the old culture and jump into the technology? And then that's a tough one. But Japanese are very good that way.
One thought, Ravi, that ran in my mind was, we have surrounded, I'm talking now in India, if only we can get our act together. I mean, there's so much going in many different directions, for a country like India. We're still a young nation, old civilization, many other things. We can get the process right, policy right, government right, God knows what right, all kinds of things right. But how it's like that famous Samuel Taylor Coleridge poem, right? The River Rhine cleans the dirt of all the city of Cologne. Who will clean River Rhine? So I think that's where we kind of stand as far as India is concerned at the moment.
So do not
Yes,
underestimate University of Tokyo, Waseda University. I mean, these are really world-class places. Yeah, I visited them technology-wise. You are just blown away. And the only thing is language. You know, sometimes most Japanese do not speak English the way we speak comfortably. So you have always this notion of, are we translating right mentally, etc. It's a great place. So I gotta go. I had another call that was waiting, which I postponed, but
sure. We will
okay.
let you go now, Professor Sheth. You have been really kind and generous, and it has been so engaging. We could go on all night, but we will need to let you go to your call, and we'll need to let our audience go to have a delayed dinner finally. And thank you to Professor Sheth, to Professor Chandra, and thank you for Keta to jumping in. Keta, your #1 task now is to learn English. So, so get on to that.
Yes, sir.
Get on to that task right now.
Okay,
And
okay.
a belated happy Teachers Day to everyone, since a lot of us here are teachers. So happy Teachers Day, and nothing else from me. Good night, unless Pankaj, you have any closing
No,
remarks.
thank you very much. Wonderful, very
Thank
kind. I think enjoyed it, every bit of it. Thank you very
Yes,
much.
it was
Thank,
great.
Bye-bye.
Thank you
thank
so
you.
much,
Bye bye.
everyone. Good
Bye.
night.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.